All right, so we're now recording. So welcome to the class. This is session 2 of our African history from 10,000 BCE to 711 CE. Dr. Clyde Ledbetter, if you're new. Always, as we start out, if you're new, what we do, we lecture for about 30 minutes, and we take a Q&A, and then we lecture again. The lecture is recorded, and the first Q&A is recorded. So if you have a question or a comment that you don't mind being recorded, you can ask it in that first session. If you don't want your question, your comment recorded, we have open discussion at the end where you're free to say what you want, and it's not recorded. So that's how we work, that's how we function. Again, today I'm joined and I'm being assisted by my general TA, my general teaching assistant, Daniel Roberts III, who's been letting you all into the sessions. And throughout the next couple of weeks, at various points, I'll also be joined by the students I'm working with this summer in the Coppin African Teachers Institute. You heard from one of them last week, and over the next couple of weeks, you might hear from, not today, but you'll hear from a few more of them as well. So I'm getting assisted by some young people that are interested in teaching history, and I'm incredibly thankful for them. All right, so let's get into what we're talking about today. So we're going to talk about the Nile Valley. We're going to talk about the beginnings of ancient Egyptian civilization today. And we will also talk about the intellectual history and why the Nile Valley is so significant in the teaching of African history, and particularly the teaching of African history in African world communities. It holds an incredible place, and there's a reason for that. And we'll get into why that is. So that's what we'll talk about today. So by way of review, last week we talked about the emergence of early man in Africa. We talked about the various lifestyles that early human beings would develop in Africa, including animal husbandry, herding. We talked about the development of agriculture and how that kind of changed things around 10,000 BCE, more settled communities, more time for human beings to think and to organize and to come up with ideas about philosophy and religion, science, and so many things as a result of being settled. Now, we also talked about climate change and how the earth goes through various phases with ice age and wetter periods than others, and drying, and it's cyclical. It's not like what's going on today. What's going on today is not natural. But every thousands of years, the earth goes through these cycles, and it affects humanity. We talked about at the very beginnings of our species, there was some type of climate catastrophe, lack of rainfall, something happened where our human population got incredibly small, and we almost went extinct. There was only a few thousand of us left, and from those 1,000 people, all of us on the earth today, all 7-something billion of us on earth today, emerged from that small group. But later on, not long, around 5,000 BCE, 4,000 BCE in Africa, you start to see a less rainfall in North Africa. The Sahara gets even more dry and starts to expand. And as a result, people that were living in North Africa and North Central Africa that were engaged in animal husbandry had to find other places to settle. Because the Sahara was advancing, rainfall wasn't as frequent as it needed to be. So they start moving into the Nile Valley. And there's folks already there as well that are engaged in agriculture, but you start to see more population density in this region. And the Nile becomes incredibly important. It's the lifeblood of the peoples that live in northern Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. And this river is incredibly important as a highway, but more importantly, particularly for Egypt, because unlike Sudan and Ethiopia, where the Nile runs through, but you still have fertile land on both sides that stretches, pretty far. You're in a savanna grassland area. Once you get up to Egypt, the Nile is flowing through the desert. So you have incredibly fertile land on both sides of the Nile, but it doesn't extend that far out. So people have to live very close to the Nile. It's very productive, but land is scarce. And even though the population is growing because you have a stable food supply, the more people, the less land, the more you need to figure out how we're going to divide up the land, how we're going to divide up resources, who gets what, and we see more hierarchy emerge, which we'll talk about today. So the ancient Egyptian name for the Nile River is the Hapi, the H-A-P-I, the Hapi. So when I refer to the Nile as the Hapi, that's what I'm talking about. I always like to start with this poem. It's by Langston Hughes, one of the great poets of the New Negro movement, also known as the Harlem Renaissance, in the first half of the 20th century. He's also a graduate of my alma mater, the first historically Black college in the United States, Lincoln University. So I always start with Langston Hughes' poem about the Negro speaks of rivers, because it's going to set the tone for the day. It's like that Jones Girl song that we listened to. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. When we talk about African civilizations, river systems are incredibly important. Nile Valley, the River Niger in West Africa, the Congo River Basin, even going down into Southern Africa, the Zambezi. Human civilizations emerged around these rivers because they provided so much for the growth of major civilizations. So when Langston Hughes writes Negro Speaks of Rivers, and I think this poem was published in 1934, I'm probably off on the year, but he's not far off. It's incredibly important for us to understand how civilizations emerge around these waterways. So again, the climate change. This is what Africa looked like when human beings first emerged, and then we get the Africa that we kind of know today in terms of the dry Sahara and forcing human populations that were in this region of North Central Africa to start migrating to the Nile River, and then some west to the bend of the Niger River. We see other great civilizations that we'll talk about in a few weeks emerge in this region here. Then, of course, like I said, the Great Congo River Basin and the great Bantu civilizations that emerged, and then going even as far south, the Orange River, the Zambezi, so on and so forth. All right, one thing to know about the Nile River. This is what the map looks like. The Nile River flows from south to north. Unlike most rivers in the world that go from north to south, the Nile flows south to north. So for the people that lived in the ancient Nile Valley, their orientation of the world was this. So when we talk about Upper Egypt, we mean South Egypt. And when we talk about Lower Egypt, it's actually north, the part closest to the Mediterranean Sea. Same thing when we talk about Nubia. Lower Nubia is in the north, Upper Nubia is in the south. So keep that in mind as we go through the next 2 weeks. We're talking about Upper Egypt, we're talking about the south, because this is how they saw the world. The Nile River flowing from south to north. So keep that in mind as we talk. So why is this so important to them? Again, Egypt is mostly desert with the exception of a few oases, I think that's the plural of oasis, and the Nile River. Every year, the Nile River floods. The snow melts in the mountains that begin in Ethiopia, and it brings, as the Nile floods and flows into the Mediterranean, it brings an incredibly fertile silt, the minerally rich mud that comes from the river flooding every year. So when the river floods, and then when it recedes, you're left with an incredibly fertile soil filled with all this silt that you can grow an abundance of crops. You can grow wheat, you can grow sorghum, you can grow all of these things to sustain human populations. The ancient Egyptians, the ancient Nubians relied on this flooding every year, and it became the basis of their civilization. Not only their agricultural civilization and their animal, feeding their animals and so on and so forth to create pasture land when they could, but also their spiritual and political system, and even their scientific understanding of the world, all based on this now, because for them, the flooding of the Nile every year provided so many opportunities to measure, so many opportunities to look at nature and make observations. And it was their lifeblood, like I had said. So we get these terms that emerge from this annual flooding that will become pillars in ancient Egyptian philosophy. One being this concept of ma'at, or it's a catch-all term. Ma'at in ancient Egyptian meant balance, it meant order, it meant harmony, it meant justice, it meant righteousness. All of these terms fit underneath this concept of ma'at, which again, it comes from the flooding of the Nile River. Because the Nile didn't flood the same way every year. You hoped that it flooded just enough that it would go over the area that it needed to go over. It would leave the very fertile silt, and then it would rescind, and then you would hope the same thing happened next year so that you could plant your crops and do your thing. But if it was out of balance, if the Nile flooded too much, it would wash your crops away. You wouldn't be able to do anything, and there would be starvation. If the Nile didn't flood enough, if there wasn't enough flooding for whatever reason that year, then your crops wouldn't get the nutrients that they need, and there might be starvation. So the observations of the Nile River, the hope and the prayers that it would flood just enough and that it would keep flooding annually, this is where this idea of balance and order and ma'at emerges from, because you want it to be just in the right place, not too much flooding and definitely not enough flooding. So that was ma'at. The flip side of ma'at is isfet, is the term isfet, which means chaos, disorder, disharmony, injustice, all of this. So for the Egyptians, order was key. The universe emerged out of chaos, and order is what the gods brought to humanity. And order is what the cosmos is trying to create itself into, from disorder into order. And this would go into their political philosophy. We'll get into that when we talk about the unification of Egypt as being two kingdoms actually being unified. So the balance between those two kingdoms, the balance between what the leadership wanted and what the everyday people wanted, that creates a justice system, which was about balance. And even in terms of your individual life, for the ancient Egyptians, life continued after death. And when you died, you had to go through this elaborate ritual. Your spirit went through this elaborate ritual, this trial that was all about Ma'at, because Ma'at was not only a concept, it was also a spiritual entity. So when you died, your heart was weighed on the balance of Ma'at. Think about the scales of justice that we have when we talk about court systems in the Western world. It's kind of where that concept emerges from. When you died, your heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. And if your heart was too heavy, which means you committed a lot of injustice in your life, you lived an unrighteous life, then your heart would be eaten by this monster that was part hippo, part jackal, part all the ferocious animals, and you would not be able to enter eternity. But if your heart was balanced with Ma'at, then you were able to live forever. So it permeates everything: the political philosophy, economic life, spiritual philosophy. Ma'at is key. So we'll come back to that because you'll see it come up when we start to get, particularly next week, we get into some of the literature that we have from ancient Egypt. This battle between Ma'at and Isfet is paramount. In terms of what we're talking about today, and in terms of secondary sources, if you want to look up anything that I'm saying, chapter 2 in Kevin Shillington's book, The History of Africa, talks about the ancient Nile Valley civilizations, and then certain chapters in General History of Africa, number 2 by UNESCO. I think it's chapters 7 and 8. But the UNESCO chapters are on our course website if you're interested in looking at those. And then I always encourage everybody, if you can, to get the Shillington book if you want to follow along with what I'm talking about in this class in a very ordered, beautifully illustrated textbook. The Shillington book is a great resource to have if you want to follow along with what I'm talking about. The evidence that we have to reconstruct ancient Egyptian history comes from a number of different sources. One of the beautiful things that we have, that we can trace ancient Egyptian history all the way back to 3000 BCE, or they're about 3000, 3100 BCE, about 5000 years ago, is the written record. The ancient Egyptians developed a writing system, one of the earliest peoples in the world to develop a writing system called metanetia, or the good speech, good writing. The Greeks called it hieroglyphics, or sacred writing. So you might know it as hieroglyphics, but the ancient Egyptians themselves called it metanetia. So we have tons of this stuff. We have it on papyrus. We have it etched into the walls of temples in ancient Egypt. We have so much of it. So we're able to really dig deep into the history of this time period, which is 5,000 years ago. Of course, the archaeological record, we'll get into that a little bit. Linguistic evidence, particularly to tie ancient Egypt to the rest of Africa, which is important for what we'll talk about in a second. Even botanical evidence. So we got all of these things that we can use to reconstruct this history, but probably the most important for our conversation is the written record. And I want to stop here and say one thing. Writing is not a measure of civilization. It's not. It's a tool that human beings use to communicate, but it's not a measure of civilization. So when we talk about African history and we talk about other places in Africa where oral history is predominant, it's just as valid as the written record, because you can tell the truth in writing and you can lie in writing, just where you can tell the truth speaking and you can lie in speaking. So there's no validity issues. The only thing the written record does is it does allow us to go further back. You can only go so far back with oral history. The written record, 5,000 years ago, we can still read it. So this is one of the reasons why the Nile Valley civilizations have such a predominance in African history, early African history, just because we have the evidence and we can tell better stories other than just relying on the archaeological evidence. So that's key. And think about why the writing was created in the first place. You're dealing with a highly centralized society where records need to be kept. You keep record of how much the Nile flooded this year, and keep those records over time so we can look to see if we see patterns. We need to keep records of who owns what land. So land is not abundant in ancient Egypt. So we need good records. We need good economic records of transactions. Highly centralized societies need writing. If it's a decentralized society where resources are abundant, the government isn't in that type of control, like what we'll see in Nubia for much of its history, you don't see the development of writing because it's not needed. Later on in Nubian history, when the government becomes much more centralized and resources become much more centralized, then you see writing develop in ancient Nubia. And we'll talk about that in week 4. So how do we know so much about the Nile Valley, particularly ancient Egypt? We got a breakthrough in the year 1799 CE, so the Common Era. The Rosetta Stone, you probably heard this term before. There's a whole language company called Rosetta Stone, teach you different language, but this is where it comes from. In the 1790s, the French general, soon to be Emperor Napoleon, invades Egypt. The reason for this, at the time, Egypt was pretty much indirectly controlled by the Ottoman Turks. And Napoleon and his competition with Britain wanted to cut Britain off from its places that it controlled in India. Napoleon knew he couldn't fight the British outright at this particular moment, so he wanted an area that he could control that could kind of disrupt Britain's trade with India and weaken Britain. So he looked at the Ottomans, he looked at their less than strong control over Egypt. They had nominal control over Egypt, but it wasn't really that tight. So Napoleon thought this would be an easy victory. He'll go into Egypt and they'll go through some other places in the Middle East like Syria, take over lands controlled by the Ottomans, and then try to cut Britain off from India. So he invades Egypt with his army. When he's there, one of his engineers stumbles upon this stone in this village not far outside of Alexandria in northern Egypt called Rosetta. They dig up this stone. And what's significant about this stone, which was created all the way back in 196 BCE, during the time that the Greeks controlled Egypt. This is during the reign of the Ptolemies, who Cleopatra VII would come out of, and some other folks. But anyway, This stone has 3 sections that all say the same thing. They're all talking about one of the Ptolemies and some event that person did, one of the rulers, Greek rulers of Egypt. So you have the Greek down here, which people could read ancient Greek, but the Demotic and the Meta-Netia, the hieroglyphics, no one could read up to this point. The last person that could read hieroglyphics had died in, I think, 400 CE. So it wasn't kept up with. And even this, Demotic is the cursive version of Meta-Netia. They couldn't read Demotic either. But now that you have one tablet that had all 3, and it became clear that they were saying the same thing, you were able to decipher the Meta-Netia, the ancient Egyptian language that hadn't been deciphered in over 1,000 years. So they looked at the Greek and they kept seeing the name Ptolemy, so they knew if we could figure out where that is in the Meta-Netia, since that's the word that keeps coming up the most, and if we could figure out where it is in Demotic, we might have some. So first French scholars were trying to decipher this, and then it went to the British, who after Napoleon's defeat in Egypt, took control over the Rosetta Stone, and then they had their scholars working on it. But it was a French scholar who had the final breakthrough, who looked at it and said, well, maybe if we bring in Coptic, which is the liturgical language of the Egyptian church, if we bring in Coptic, which is probably closer aligned to the Demotic, since they both came out of Egypt, maybe we'll be able to make some headway. So he brings in the Coptic, and then that opens up that unlocks it, and they're able to translate it. And for the first time in over 1,000 years, people are able to read the Meta-Netia, read the hieroglyphics, and a craze in a Egypt mania explodes in the West. It explodes in England and France, in Germany, in the United States. And this is the beginnings of the academic discipline of Egyptology. It emerges. So you start to see, once people can decipher the hieroglyphics, all these expeditions to Egypt, people collecting as much as they can of the ancient artifacts. We're starting to see the beginnings of archaeology also as a discipline. People going to Egypt, refining the best ways to dig things, and looking at the hieroglyphics to find out where locations of certain things are. People are looking for treasure. It's Egypt mania takes over. Even though, going all the way back to the Romans and Greeks, and there always been a fascination with Egypt, but people just didn't know much about it other than the Bible, of course. Egypt was mentioned in the Bible. They knew the pyramids, they were there. You can't deny the pyramids and the Sphinx, they're there. Everybody sees them. They're the only wonder of the ancient world that's still in existence. There were 8 wonders of the world, and 7 wonders of the world in ancient times. And the pyramids of Giza are the only ones that are still up. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are gone. The Colossus of Rhodes is gone. Some of these other, the Lighthouse of Alexandria is gone. But the pyramids still remain. So Egypt mania takes over the West. Egyptology emerges as an academic discipline. Archaeology in Egypt is growing. But I want you to really look at these years. So the Rosetta Stone founded 1799, deciphered 1821, 1822. What's going on in the world for African people while all of this is happening? We're right in one of the high periods of enslavement. And remember, one of the justifications for enslavement of Africans in the Americas and other places is that African people don't think. African people don't have civilization. They're not intelligent. They are really a step up from animals, if that. So this is one of the reasons why we can enslave African people. Yet when all this is coming out, African thinkers at the time who are at the same time fighting against enslavement, fighting against these ideas that Africa is not civilized, are looking at these developments and they're saying, wait a minute, you're giving all this praise to Egypt. Where is Egypt again? Oh yeah, that's in Northeast Africa. Wait a minute. I'm reading this Bible that you told me to read because, during part of the enslavement process, a lot of Africans are introduced to Western version of Christianity. So reading the Bible, and they say, wait a minute. In Genesis, it says Noah had these sons, and one of your other justifications for slavery is that Black people are the cursed children of Ham. But it also lists Ham's sons as Cush and Egypt being one of Ham's sons. So wait a minute. I think we need to talk about this whole Egypt thing, and lauding it as one of the birthplaces of civilization. And this is right in Africa. This is us. Wait a minute. This is us. This is what the African thinkers are saying. And they're starting to articulate that in their writings while they're fighting against enslavement and fighting against this idea of Africans being uncivilized and having no contribution to human civilization. So again, look at these dates. 1799, it's found. 1821, 1822 is deciphered. 1829, the African in America in Boston, David Walker, writes this book called An Appeal to Colored Peoples of the World, where he gives a very radical response to enslavement. It says that, it's perfectly legal and right for African people to violently resist enslavement in the United States. Some people think this article that he wrote was one of the inspirations for Nat Turner's rebellion that would happen 2 years later. David Walker spends this entire treatise pushing Black people to reclaim their humanity, to throw off the shackles of enslavement. And this book went to African people all over the United States clandestinely. He was a tailor by trade, so he sewed his book into the pockets of African sailors in Boston, and they took it to places like Charleston and New Orleans and other places. And it was banned in the South because it was so incendiary. But at the very beginning of the book, he addresses the Egypt question. He says, some of my brethren do not know who Pharaoh and the Egyptians were. I know it to be a fact. Some of them take the Egyptians to have been a gang of devils, not knowing any better. And they, Egyptians, having got possessions of the Lord's people, treated them nearly as cruel as Christian Americans do us. This is one of the arguments that he was making in the book, that you can look at what happened to the Hebrew people in the Old Testament and look at how they were enslaved, then compare that to what's happening to you in America, and it doesn't even compare. The so-called, and he calls them the pretend Christians. He says the pretend Christians treat you worse than the so-called Hebrews who were enslaved in the Old Testament. So he says, treated them nearly as cruel as Christian Americans do us at the present day. For the information as such, I would only mention the Egyptians were Africans or colored people, such as we are. Some of them yellow, others dark, a mixture of Ethiopians and natives of Egypt, about the same as you see the colored people of the United States at the present day. So Walker's aware that they found this Rosetta Stone, they deciphered it, and all this stuff is going on. He said, okay, the Egyptians, they're Black like us. He's one of the first people to really talk about this. There were others, including Martin Delaney, one of my favorite ancestors. Martin Delaney grew up born in Virginia, but he grew up in Pittsburgh, trained as a medical doctor, one of the first Black medical doctors, official medical doctors. He formed a Black vigilante group because Black folks were being attacked in Pittsburgh and no one was there to protect them. He went to the police wouldn't protect Black people, so they formed their own vigilante group called Hannibal's Guards. He had a historical understanding. We'll talk about Hannibal in a few weeks. He was convinced before the Civil War erupted in the United States that Black folks don't have a future in America, and he convened a number of immigration conventions with the idea of where should Black folks go, because we can't stay in America. So should we go to the Caribbean? Should we go to South America? Should we go back to Africa? He ruled out Canada, actually. He said he was under the belief that eventually Canada was going to become a part of the United States and that the racial treatment of Blacks would just continue. So he said, let's not even do that because eventually Canada's going to get taken over by the US anyway. This is all the way back in the 1850s, by the way. In 1859, he and a Jamaican, actually, Robert Patterson, traveled to Nigeria and negotiated in Yoruba land for Africans in the diaspora to come back to Africa. And there's a successful treaty that he signs with one of the African leaders. So he's an incredible man, but he was also a publisher. He was also a historian. And he writes in 1880, a book called The Origins of Race and Color, or Principle of Ethnology, The Origin of Races and Color, with an archaeological compendium of Ethiopian Egyptian civilization, from years of careful examination and inquiry by Martin Robinson Delaney. And I love how he puts all his credentials in the book. Delaney says, look, I'm formerly a physician, surgeon, practitioner in the diseases of women and children, member of the International Statistics Congress of London. He's a member of the National Association for the Promotion of Social Sciences. He was also an honorable, a major in the US Army. And at the time that he wrote this, he was a justice of Charleston, South Carolina, by the commission of the governor. So he did a lot of things in his life: politician, statesman, warrior, publisher, so many things. But he writes in this book, and I put a copy of this on our course website if you want to read it. This submission of the hieroglyphic representations to be found on the temples and monuments of Egypt of the advanced status of the Negro race settles at once the controversy and leaves only to be proven the fact that the earliest settlers, builders of the pyramids, sculptors of the sphinxes, and original god kings were Blacks of the Negro race. So this is 1880 that he's writing this. Again, reminding all those people, because by the time we get to 1880, slavery is over. But there is a new form of, a new denial of Black humanity known as scientific racism that has emerged in the 19th century in European and in American schools. They are using the works of Darwin. Darwin didn't say this, but they're flipping Darwin's words in terms of evolution and other things to create this idea of racial hierarchy, with of course whites being on the top and Blacks being on the bottom. And they're trying to prove it scientifically. And people like Martin Delaney is saying, wait a minute, how can you can't say that if you're saying that the very earliest civilization, the one that we have all this information about, is an African civilization. You can't say that human beings are unequal and have different capabilities based on race. Delaney argues this. Edward Wilmot Blyden, born in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, he migrated to the US and then to Liberia in 1850, the president of Liberian College, considered the father of Pan-Africanism, the early proponent for African unity and African redemption, writes a number of books. Again, these multi-talented individuals. He's a politician, he's a university scholar, university president, a writer, a traveler, and he writes two books, The Negro in Ancient History and From West Africa to Palestine. He writes a bunch of other classic books as well. But these books that he wrote in 1869 and 1878, I want to just share one of the things that he wrote. If I could pull it up, 1 second. All right. He actually travels to Egypt. He goes and visits the pyramids and on his way to the Middle East. And he says this: while standing in the central hall of the pyramid, I thought of the lines of Teague, the Liberian poet, when urging his countrymen to noble deeds. From Pyramidal Hall, from Karnak's sculptured wall, from Thebes, they loudly call, retake your fame. This, thought I, is the work of my African progenitors. Teague was right. They had fame, and their descendants should strive by nobler deeds to retake it. Feelings came over me far different from those which I have felt when looking at the mighty works of European genius. I felt that I had particular heritage in the Great Pyramid, built before the tribes of mankind had been so generally scattered, and therefore before they had acquired their different geographical characteristics, built by that branch of descendants of Noah, the enterprising sons of Ham, for whom I am descended. The blood seemed to flow faster through my veins. I seemed to hear the echoes of those illustrious Africans. Very important how he puts this, because it's not so much just about proving to European academics and others, and just the general public at large, that Black folks were equal, but also the sense of pride in having this example of African civilization at a time where Africa is about to be colonized. Africans in the Americas and the Caribbean and are being oppressed, just coming out of slavery, about to enter this phase of Jim Crow. They're going to be colonized in Jamaica and Trinidad and Martinique and other places. They are writing that we were at one point one of the strongest nations in the world, and we can be that again. It was for Blyden, seeing the pyramids, understanding that they came from African people, gave him this inspiration. And then last but not least, I'll talk about Antony Furman of Haiti. So we talked about Martin Delaney from Pittsburgh in the US. We talked about Blyden coming from the Virgin Islands, but spent most of his life in West Africa and Liberia and Sierra Leone. And then Furman from Haiti, who out of all of them probably did the most in terms of academic work. And again, he wasn't just an academic, he was a writer, he was a politician, he served as Secretary of State in Haiti in the late 1800s, early 20th century. And he writes this, or according to someone who wrote an article on him, Furman conducted his own research, appropriating the idioms of Egyptology, and used a multiplicity of sources and approaches, such as the critical use of linguistic sources, linking ancient Egyptian language to those of Africa, a method also used later on, almost 70 years later by Shenkan Tijot, who we talked about last week. Furman also studied sculptural depictions, belief systems of ancient Egypt, migration patterns based on historical texts, and the study of the flora and fauna of ancient Egypt, and used the latest contemporary sources such as T.H. Haney's archaeological study of the Egyptian headrest as an Ethiopian artifact. So all this to say, Furman did what Shenkan Tijot would do a century later, bringing in all of these different methods, not just the historical method, but scientific methods, anthropological methods, linguistic methods, to reconnect ancient Egypt in particular, but the Nile Valley in general, to the rest of African civilizations. Because once this stuff was found and these hieroglyphics were deciphered, it became this crazy idea that, okay, well, yeah, this stuff is geographically in Africa, but the Egyptians weren't African and they definitely aren't Black. But the archaeology was proving that wrong. And this was being done by European archaeologists. The further south they were going in Egypt, the further up the Nile that they were going with their archaeological digs, the blacker the material became and the older the material became. Yet that idea that the ancient Egyptian civilization was somehow not Black continued and still continues to this day. I will go back to that. But you see the Hollywood version of ancient Egypt. The great Ten Commandments movie with Charlton Heston that comes on in the States every Easter to celebrate the Passover. You have this representation, Yul Brynner and this woman playing Egyptian pharaoh. But you can say, oh, that's 1956. Things have changed. Well, not so much. Exodus, God Kings came out in 2014. You got Christian Bale as Moses and some other guy as the Egyptian pharaoh. Gods of Egypt came out in 2016. They're all European-looking folks. They had a movie about the New Kingdom pharaoh, Akhenaten. And this is the woman that they had playing Akhenaten's mother, Queen T, Queen Tai. This is what she looked like in real life. We know from the statue, the bust of her, and this is who is playing her. You have this guy playing the actual pharaoh Akhenaten, and this is what he looked like. Another image of him and his wife, Nefertari. This is what they looked like, how they presented themselves in one of the periods of the most realistic artistic expressions come during Akhenaten's period, which is very late in Egypt. This is the New Kingdom. This is almost 1,000 years after the pyramids were built. And this is how they're representing themselves. Another image of Akhenaten from the side profile. If you have any other doubt, you see his big old African lips and his nice high African cheekbones. So this is what we're dealing with, and the continued division of North Africa in general, but Egypt in particular from African history. It's not by accident. So to try to rectify this, and I make this joke every time I teach this class, but this is how it kind of, as ridiculous as what I'm about to say, is as ridiculous as these depictions. If we were to make a movie about Rome, great European civilization, did a lot of things, and they had these figures like Julius Caesar and Octavian, who would become Augustus, the first emperor. If we were going to make a movie, and then we had Don Cheadle playing Caesar and Daniel Kaluuya playing Augustus, what would the uproar be? What would the uproar be? There's so much uproar online whenever there's a Black Spider-Man or a Black Little Mermaid. These are fake people. Yet when I remember a couple years ago when the new Star Wars movies came out, then there was a black stormtrooper. People lost their mind, and these are fake. Yet when it comes to African history, it's okay to show people that didn't look like the actual people that were there on the big screen, and it's fine. So this is something that we have to continue to teach. It's incredibly important, and this is one of the reasons why it's constantly brought up in African history and why we spend a lot of time on it, because you can't deny the grandeur of ancient Egypt. And few people, the pyramids are there, the Sphinx are there, the temples are there, all this stuff is there. So while Egypt is being praised in the 19th century, Africans are being oppressed, and this idea that Africans have no connection to ancient Egypt in order to maintain that oppression through slavery and then colonization. The myth that Africans have no civilization, that Africans have no intellectual capability in particular. So we'll stop there for a second before we get into the Old Kingdom, and we'll open it up to any questions or comments, and then we'll get into what was going on in the Old Kingdom. So if you have a question, you don't mind it being recorded, just raise your hand and we can unmute you, or you can put it in the chat. So I'm gonna ask Daniel to look in the chat, see if we have anything, and any questions. Jennifer and David, go ahead.
Hi, I was just wondering about the link between hieroglyphics and cuneiform, because I had a friend who was studying archaeology, and she used to spend a whole lot of time doing what she called cuneiform. Is it just a different name for the same thing, or is it slightly different of whatever?
Different areas. So cuneiform emerges in Mesopotamia in what's now Iraq,
Okay.
but very similar historical circumstances in that was a river civilization as well, and kind of grew up along, not at the same time as Egypt, and very similar historical circumstances where they needed a highly centralized government system, and then they needed a record keeping. So they created cuneiform almost contemporaneously as the Egyptians created the hieroglyphics.
Okay.
Further east, yeah.
Thanks.
Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I'm glad for the explanation about the Egyptian civilization. Europeans and American archaeologists, as a matter of fact, tried to discredit the accomplishments of the Egyptians by saying the monuments, the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the temples were built by alien civilizations.
That's the new thing. Yeah, that's the new one, the alien. Yeah. Oh man, yeah, it's gotten ridiculous now. It's gotten to the point where you can't look at history in any honest way and say that any of these monuments and things were built by folks outside of Africa. So now, and it's not just Egypt, but even some of the monoliths in South America and some places in Asia, if it's almost like if we don't see evidence of white folks, then it must be aliens. Because obviously Black folks, indigenous people, Asian people, they can't possibly do these type of things. And that's become a new popular hypothesis, which it's outrageous, but yeah. And even going back further, the idea that another myth that has to be dispelled is this idea that the monuments in Egypt were built by Hebrew slaves. Even the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible never refers, if you read the Bible in Hebrew, those people aren't referred to as slaves. They're laborers. And there's a history in ancient Egypt of corvée labor, of forcing people to pay their taxes in the form of labor in terms of building monuments and so on, but they're not slaves in the way that we understand slaves. And even the Hebrew text doesn't call them slaves. They're just forced laborers. There's a difference. And so a lot of people look at the pyramids, look at things that say, oh, that was built by Hebrew slaves. Well, number one, there's no such thing as a Hebrew when those things were built. Now, some of the later monuments, we get thousands of years after the pyramids were built, Some of that was built by forced labor. It could have been from people from the outside and people from the Middle East, such as the Hebrews, but not the major ones that you think of when you think of ancient Egypt. So a lot of stuff that has to be cleared up in the popular imagination of what Egypt was. Kevin Friday, go ahead, and then I'm gonna ask Daniel what's in the chat.
Yeah, hi. You kind of touched on what I was gonna bring up, which is the laborers. Because I've heard this before, they weren't actually slaves, they were like paid laborers. The other question that I have is about what would you describe in terms ethnically speaking, were the original Egyptians, were they a lot similar to today's Somali, Ethiopian populations, like what we call the Cushitic peoples? I've heard that that's what they were, or
kind of a mix. I mean, you see different types because it was a crossroads of the world. So you see folks that would look like people that live in the Horn of Africa now. You see folks that look like people that live in Sudan and North Central Africa. So it's definitely a mix depending on where folks come from. You look at Sudan, you see people of all colors. You see people from the darkest of beautiful, dark, blue-black folks in Sudan. And then you see people that are lighter in Sudan. And so you have a mix of those types of groups. Now, later on in Egyptian history, you get other folks that come in, but this is after what we call the classical period. So you have Greeks that come in at, Alexander comes in at 332 BCE. Now, just for comparison's sake, the Great Pyramids were built around 2600 BCE. The Greeks come in 300 BCE. So it's almost 2,300 years of difference. And the other fact that blows people's mind is the last pharaoh in Egypt, independent pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra VII, who is a mixed Greek African ancestry. She's closer to our time in 2021 than she was to the building of the pyramids. This is how ancient that civilization is. So when we see the Persians come into Egypt, we see the Greeks come into Egypt, the Assyrians come into Egypt, later on, the Arabs come into Egypt. This stuff happens very, very late. Particularly the Arab invasion doesn't happen until large-scale Arab immigration into Egypt doesn't happen until the 9th century CE. So the 800s and 900s CE, Common Era. So the folks that you see in Egypt now aren't an accurate representation. In southern Egypt, you see more, because there's Nubian people in southern Egypt, you see more of a representation, but it's not the same. That's like saying the people that live in Canada today, 200 years ago, don't look like the people that lived in Canada, in 1500, 1400, so on and so forth. Yeah, that's.
I had a follow-up question to that, and that is because this narrative seems there's a huge hole in the white supremacist narrative that Black people could run civilizations, and I think it stems from the fact that at some point, people who looked like us or shared our complexion lost. Like, we had a civilization and we lost it. How did we lose it? Like, why did all these people invade Egypt, and how were they able to outfox African people and take over the civilization and everything? And now we're looked upon as uncivil. And how did that happen?
We're going to get into, that's one of the things that we'll get into as this class progresses. But the important thing to point out, though, on a historical scale, I wouldn't look at this as a loss, but something that the Egyptians call an intermediate period. There are times where, even in Egypt's history itself, there are times where Egypt was strong and doing this thing. Then there were times that it would break into chaos, but then it would come out of that chaos. We're in an intermediate period in terms of African world people, because if you really look at it, enslavement took about 100 million people, give or take, either died in Africa or en route or made it to the Americas. About 100 million people were affected by the transatlantic, not even the Eastern, but the transatlantic slave trade, European initiated slave trade. But even still, there were Africa didn't fall as a result of that. Then in the late 19th century, you get colonization where Africa gets conquered, which we talked about last spring, with the exception of Ethiopia. So really, colonization lasts from, say, the bulk of it lasts from the late 1800s to 1960. So historically speaking, that's not that long of a time. We're coming out of that, and things are still chaotic, but we're emerging out of it. So don't look at it so much as a loss, but an interruption is the best way to look at it. Because when you look at it as a loss, you're giving too much power to the folks that came to invade and do these things. It's more of an interruption than it is a total loss. Just like when we talk about European civilization, Europeans say, yeah, we had the Roman Empire, and then it fell, and then Western Europe went into something that historians used to call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, but then there was a Renaissance in Western Europe and it got back. We don't say that Europe lost completely. So all of these things, and we're gonna, as the weeks go on, that will make more sense. So we're gonna get to that, talk about what happened and what caused the interruption. We'll call it the interruption. Before I go to Mr. Thomas, let me go to Daniel really quick, and then I'll go to Mr. Thomas. Anything in the chat, Daniel?
The only thing that is in the chat was the question about cuneiform. So there's nothing new right now.
Okay. And Mr. Thomas, you'll be our last question and comment, then I'll start talking about the Old Kingdom.
Dr. Ledbetter, thanks to all. I thank you particularly and the participants who meet here week after week. It gives me hope. Presently, looking at the situation in Haiti, Cuba, South Africa, and Jamaica, these situations cause me to be extremely cynical and hopeless. And it is classes, it is meetings like these that actually give me a sense of belonging. And I want to thank you all.
Thank you always, Mr. Thomas, for your participation and your words of wisdom to us. And we could probably talk about those things in the open discussion, but I will say just briefly that what's going on are these eruptions that sometimes are necessary for change to happen. Change rarely happens peacefully. And these eruptions that we're seeing in Haiti, they're reactions to years of exploitation in various forms. And the people are reacting to that. And when these periods happen, they're unfortunate and they're chaotic. They're isfet, as the ancient Egyptians would say, they're isfet, they're chaos. But sometimes out of chaos, order can emerge. It's just a matter of, will that order be despotic order, an order that is about injustice and exploitation? It's still order, or will it be an order that's actually in the benefit of the people? But order will come out of the chaos. We just have to know which side it's going to be. So we'll talk about that in the open discussion though, but thank you for your comments, Mr. Thomas. So let's get into it. So let's talk about the Old Kingdom. We're actually going to transition into, so what were they actually studying in ancient Egypt? What do we get into? So after those people started moving into the Nile Valley, they started to establish civilization. So we're going to talk about the Old Kingdom and the early dynastic period of ancient Egypt and the Old Kingdom. And this is just the step pyramid. We'll talk about that creation. And I'm going to go kind of fast because I want to get done by, say, 12:15, 12:20. So just zooming out a little bit so we can kind of get an understanding of where we're at geographically. We're talking about this area here, the ancient Nile Valley. We're going to talk about Kush/Nubia in week 4, which is a contemporaneous civilization with Egypt and possibly older. Actually, it is older, but the period that we'll talk about with Nubia, we'll talk about in 2 weeks. And the interactions between these two are incredibly important that shape both of their histories. There are times where Egypt is strong and it is able to conquer into parts of lower Kush or northern Kush. And there are times where Kush/Nubia, it goes by both of those names, is strong enough that they're able to conquer all of Egypt. And we see that in the 25th dynasty. But we'll get into that next week. In terms of the way this class is set, we're going to start from here. Then we're going to go into North Central and Northern Africa. We'll talk about Carthage. Then we'll talk about Ghana in a few weeks. Then we'll talk about the Bantu migrations, which go from this part of Nigeria, Cameroon, all the way into Central Africa and East and Southern Africa. Then we will go around, we'll talk about the East African coast a little bit, and then we will end our class where we started with Northeast and North Africa when we talk about early Christianity in Egypt and the arrival of Islam in Egypt, and then ultimately the emergence of the Moors who conquered Spain and Portugal. We'll get into that in a few weeks. Anyway, the periodization of ancient Egypt generally goes like this. We talk about classical ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. We start with around 3200 BCE, which is called the Archaic period. This is a period of warlords and early city formation in ancient Egypt, which is going to lead to the Old Kingdom. Then there's the first intermediate period, which happens. There's chaos, there's climate change. That happens. Then there's the Middle Kingdom. Then there's another intermediate period of invasion and chaos. Then there's the New Kingdom. Then there's another intermediate period. And then there's the 25th dynasty of the Nubians. It's kind of where we generally stop when we talk about classical African history. So we're going from classical Nile Valley civilization or classical Egypt. So from 3200 BCE all the way up until 660 BCE is the period that we'll be talking about over the next 2 weeks. Today, we're just going to talk about the Old Kingdom, then we'll stop. All right, just for the sake of world comparisons, China's first dynasty is around 2700. The Great Wall isn't even constructed until 770. It's a 500-year period, different sections of that Great Wall, very late. So the Great Wall is being constructed around the time that the Nubians are in Egypt. So this is after the New Kingdom, very late. The Vedas, the Hindu sacred texts in India, written around 1700. These were oral traditions, but the writing of them comes around the time of the second intermediate period. And then the Greeks, the progenitors of Western civilization, they have their Archaic period all the way in 900 BCE or somewhere between these two areas. This is when the Iliad is written by Homer and so many and these other things. So we don't get Greek writing until all the way down here when Egypt is already old. All right, just for world comparison. So how do we know so much about the Archaic period in the Old Kingdom? Yeah, we had the Meta Neter, but really the archaeological evidence is what we rely on. And a lot of that archaeology has given us the Meta Neter, but we can also look at the burials of folks, provide us a lot of information about ancient Egypt even before writing was invented. We can know about how people lived. We learn about social hierarchies. For example, in modern terms, we know the ancient Egyptians embalmed their dead, but even before the embalming, they buried people. The Proto-Egyptian civilizations or the civilizations that will become Egypt, they buried people with their goods that they had in life. So we can tell how people live based on what we find in their burial sites. So this is actually a person, they do this in Louisiana and some of the other places, where instead of just putting people in a casket, they embalm them and then they sit them up and people come to the wakes and the funerals and they interact with their dead relatives as they kind of were. So we see this woman died and we can tell that she loved her crossword puzzles and her cigarettes. It's probably what killed her. She loved her New Orleans Saints and her Bush's beer, and this is somebody she loved, and her cards. So we can see how this woman lived, her sunglasses, her shades, and all that, and how she lived, her ring, her watch. All this is going to be buried with her. So we have a good understanding of how she lived. Or somebody like this guy here, and then again, these are actually photos of folks that have been embalmed there. You see him with his Nikes on and his polo shirt and how he lived, or this brother here who loved his Celtics. I think it's a Kyrie jersey when Kyrie played for the Celtics, and he got his Doritos and his root beer and his PlayStation controller in his hand and all that. So if he's buried like this, we can see how he lived. Or think about it, if one of us died and we were buried with our goods, you can tell the difference between how people live. Some people were rich; they're going to have very nice things in their burial sites. Versus many of us who are just working class folks, we might have a few luxury goods, but not as many as the rich people. So by doing the archaeology, we can kind of recreate the early history of Egypt based on, and we can tell if there was long distance trade based on what was in the burials. If there's ostrich feathers, which we know was a luxury item that came from Sudan, we know that there was this interaction between Egypt and Sudan. If there was a number of gold items or other things that came from long distances, we can see that. So we can put that history together. There's this another guy with his living family, so we could see him. He was in the brass band in New Orleans, so on and so forth. So you guys get the idea. So what we had before the unification of Egypt, we had 42 sapats, or these city-states that existed. So as, like I said, as the desert advanced and people moved into the Nile Valley, they brought their herds, and they realized there wasn't that much land, so people had to start fighting over land. And then people had to start grouping up and following whoever was the strongest warrior. Because if he could offer you protection, you would trade your subservience to this person or acknowledge them as the war chief or whatever, and rock with him, and then form a city state. And then they would have their own religion and their own ways of looking at the world. And there were 42 of these along the Nile River. The general boundary that we say between ancient Egypt and Nubia is something called the First Cataract, the First Cataract of Nile. There are a number of cataracts in the Nile River, with these very rocky areas in the river that make it unpassable for boats. So you got to go over land to get back to the river. So this is where the First Cataract is. This is the general boundary between Upper Egypt and Lower Nubia. So from that first boundary, we see all of these different city-states that emerge, all with their own warlord leaders and different rituals and beliefs, but they're all sharing the Nile River. There's 42 of them. What starts to emerge in Upper Egypt first, in these three centers, and we notice from the archaeological record, here in Canopolis, Nagata, and the twin towns of this and Abydos, we start to see very powerful warlords emerge, people that are able to marshal a number of people into the field. They have control over a lot of cattle. Cattle is incredibly important at this time. And they become incredibly powerful. And they are very much interested in controlling long distance trade. So they're no longer just content with having political and military power in their individual city. They want to be able to control the trade all up and down the Nile River. This is going to be the start of the idea of unifying this from some of these warlords. One of the first historical personalities that we have in the world, who's like name that we know. Now we're starting to get into actual history, not just the archaeology, but we're actually able to put some names to some of these people. One of these warlords was named King Scorpion. And we know that because here's what he looks like. And we see this scorpion symbol next to him. We know that was his name. At least that's what he was called. So King Scorpion comes from Upper Egypt in the south. And he comes from this place here, Nekhen, the Greeks called Heracanopolis, or the city of the hawk. He emerges from here. And this is what's called a mace head. This is the scorpion mace head that was found. And it's from around 3100 BCE. And it shows him with the crown of Upper Egypt. This crown you see here is the crown of Upper Egypt. In this, you see him holding a hoe, so you can tell that agriculture is incredibly important to the people. These are folks that are, holding fans, so we're saying that he has servants. So we see in this hierarchy and that he's incredibly powerful. So King Scorpion. So King Scorpion is considered, since he's the first person that we see with this crown in the archaeological record, he is considered the first person to unify these southern sapats. Everything you see in red, he went from Nekhen all the way down the Nile and conquered all of these other sapats and created the kingdom of Upper Egypt. So everything you see from 1 to 22, stopping right here. This is all Upper Egypt. He conquered all of this, and he's wearing the crown to show that. About 100 years later, we get this other piece of historical information with another name, the name of Narmer, who the Greeks called Menes. When the Greeks controlled Egypt, they funded a scholar named Manetho to do a chronicle of all the rulers of Egypt. And he starts his chronicle, he goes back into the records of ancient Egypt, because at the time they could still read the Meta Neter. This is around 300 BCE, 200 BCE. Manetho goes back into the records, he can read the Meta Neter, and he reads all the kings list, and he sees the first king's name was Narmer or Menes. Narmer actually means catfish. So we see these early kings appropriating the names of these ferocious animals. Have you ever seen a wild, big, large Nile catfish? They're very ferocious animals. So the kings wanted to, get that energy because they're warlords. I mean, primarily, that's what they are. They're warlords. They're going and they're conquering other areas. So you got to be the strongest cat in the region, the strongest bull in the yard. So he's King Catfish. So Scorpion, we don't know if Scorpion was his direct predecessor or there were some people in between, but what we know is there's King Scorpion, and the next historical figure we have is King Narmer, who the Greeks called Menes. So Narmer comes along, and we get the Narmer palette that was created around 3000 BCE, which many folks think depicts the unification of Egypt, the two lands, Lower Egypt in the north, combining with Upper Egypt in the south. And he comes from Upper Egypt. He comes from this town here, the town of This, or Abydos. This is where he emerges from. So he's continuing the work of King Scorpion. This is a lot of information on it. We're seeing that, you see Narmer here, and he's holding a mace, which is, a weapon. It's a stick with a heavy ball at the end that you can use to bash somebody's head in. So you see him holding up a vanquished enemy, and he's grabbing him by the head, and he's about to bash his head in. So very strong. We see cattle represented on this palette. You see the god Heru serving up his enemies to him. So we're seeing an early representation of Egyptian civilization. You're seeing people under his foot being trampled. On this side, you're seeing him represented as a bull. Again, cattle, incredibly important at this point, trampling his enemies. You see these two mythical animals that are being united, which folks think this is a representation of the uniting of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is the very important aspect of this palace. This is the front side of it, this is the back side. You see his enemies with their heads between the heads chopped off and their heads between their legs, showing that he's a conqueror. But here's the most important part. When we zoom in, he has this crown on. This is the crown of Lower Egypt. Going back, this is the crown of Upper Egypt, the same crown that King Scorpion had, and this is the crown of Lower Egypt. The fact that he is shown on this palette, having both of these crowns, means that he is the first true pharaoh or Per'ah of ancient Egypt. And this is another ceremonial mace head of Narmer, which shows his wedding to a princess from the north, kind of just, again, reinforcing the unification of the region. Again, you see how important cattle and goats are. This is probably a representation of the dowry that was paid or something like that. See more cattle and all that. So those two crowns, the double crown of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, representing the uniting of the two lands. This is the first pharaoh. This is the first major, one of the first major rulers in world history, the uniter of Upper and Lower Egypt, Narmer. So he combines all 42 of these sapats, and then he establishes his capital at Memphis, right here. This is the first capital of the United Kingdom of ancient Egypt, Memphis, right in the middle between the 42 sapats that existed in the Nile Delta region, where the Nile breaks up and goes into the Mediterranean, and the rest, the other sapats that are, here, south of Memphis. So Memphis was seen as the capital right in the middle of uniting the two lands. Not long after Narmer does this, we get another historical figure, and Per'ah is the ancient Egyptian word for pharaoh, Per'ah. it means the great house. The great house literally is what it translates to. So when I say Per-Ah, I mean the pharaoh. That's a title. So the Per-Ah Mernereth, very important Per-Ah, because this is the first female pharaoh. And look at the date. This is 2900 BCE. This is about 100 years after Menes. This is all in the first dynasty. This is one family of people that ruled Egypt. So after Narmer becomes pharaoh, his descendants are the first dynasty of ancient Egypt. And she's in this first dynasty. So this is the first record we have anywhere historically with an actual name of a female ruler. And that's Per-Ah Menerneth. She's the first female ruler in historical record. And we know that she ruled around 2900 BCE. And this is a cartouche. This is with her name and image on it, showing her as the pharaoh, as the one that ran the country. We don't know too much about her reign, but we know that she was a pharaoh. A couple of centuries later, when we start to get into the third dynasty. So, you know, this is about 350 years after Narmer. So another family, probably a general, somebody's coup d'etat. We don't know what caused the switch. Another family takes over, then another family after that. Empires go through dynasties. So by the time we get to the third dynasty, we start to see these great pyramid builders emerge in the third and the fourth dynasties, around 2650 BCE. Before the step pyramid, the rulers in ancient Egypt were buried in things like this. They were buried underground, but on top were these mounds that the Arabs called mastabas, but the ancient Egyptians called the projects, or the houses of eternity. And they were actually representations of one of their spiritual entities called Ptah. So think about what I brought up at the beginning of the class, the rescinding of the Nile River every year when it floods. So the Nile floods, and then after it rescinds, you start to see the land that you're going to plant on emerge from the waters in these mounds. This became an incredibly powerful spiritual symbol to the Egyptians. So that mound, which is almost a representation of order coming out of chaos. You think back to even the Judeo-Christian Bible, where it talks about, you know, things emerging out of water, and first it was water, and then land was built, all that. So the idea of water rescinding, and then these mounds were called Ptah. And this is one of the first representations of God in ancient Egypt. So when they died, they built these mounds. The purpose was to help the soul go from the underworld, because remember, they believed in the immortality of the soul. So when the pharaoh died, he's buried here, and his soul was going to transcend through this mound of creation and into the afterlife. So this is what they first looked like. But then a pharaoh, a very powerful pharaoh, comes around named Joseph, and this is his bust and what he looked like. Pharaoh, and you can still see where he was brown, where the paint was, because they, you know, cast themselves. These things used to be colored. So Joseph emerges. He's a member of the third dynasty. And Pharaoh Joseph has an architect / physician named Imhotep. And we go back to Martin Delaney. Delaney was a warrior. He was a medical doctor. He was a publisher. Imhotep was another one of these African multi-geniuses. He is considered, the Greeks actually, because his name was of such renown. This happened all the way back in 2600 BCE, but he was so good as a medical doctor that thousands of years later, or close to 2,000 years later, the Greeks had deified Imhotep. First, the Egyptians deified him, and then the Greeks deified him as almost a god of medicine, because he was so renowned, and he came up with so many medical techniques and he was a scribe, so he wrote all this stuff down, and he was a government official, and he was an architect as well. So the Pharaoh Joseph goes to his right-hand man, Imhotep, and he says, Imhotep, you know, everybody has, all the pharaohs that came before me, they have mastabas, and they're cool, but I want to do something big. I want to go bigger. So Imhotep says, Pharaoh, I got you. Let's build something more magnificent. And he builds the step pyramid. So he takes one of these and he puts another one on top and another one on top and another on top till you get to the levels of the step pyramid, which is still standing. It's in Saqqara. So by the time it was built, and it's a stone structure made out of mud brick, still standing. When it was built, it was the largest building in the world. It stayed the largest building in the world for a couple of centuries until the next pharaohs came along. Because then they would take this idea and they say, okay, we want to do something bigger than Pharaoh Joseph. So attempts were made to make true pyramids, and they had some, there's some trial and error. There's a bent pyramid in Egypt, which looks like this, and then they got the angle wrong, so it's kind of bent with an image of it, but you have one of those. So they had their trial and error until we get to the 4th dynasty. And these are when the Great Pyramids are built. So this is around 2500 BCE. When we get to the true pyramids, the true Great Pyramids that are at Giza. And we also get the Sphinx, what the Greeks called the Sphinx. So here are the pyramid builders. It's a grandson, a son, a grandfather, a father, and a son built the Great Pyramids in the 4th dynasty. You get Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure are the builders of the Great Pyramids. So this is what they are. These are their statues. And you can, again, draw attention. You can see their features. You can see what they look like, the Great Pyramid builders. So they built these. Again, we don't know exactly. There's all types of hypotheses of how the pyramids were built, and how they moved these, 30-ton stones and put them in such intricate construction that you can't even slide a piece of paper in between the bricks. And there's no mortar in the pyramids. They're just slid into place so precise that you can't even slip a piece of paper between them. And then they have astrological, people have connected them with the 3 stars and Osiris is built, and they line up. So it's an incredible feat of both engineering, astrology, the way it looks when you're looking at it from the Nile. It's just an amazing feat. And then the face on the Sphinx is Khafre's face. This is who was on the Sphinx. He had that built in front of his pyramid. So incredible pyramid builders. These things are still standing until the 19th century. The Khufu's pyramid was still the largest building in the world, all the way until the 19th century. So again, this African genius that you're seeing from a very early age, it's from 2500 BCE. So by way of wrapping up, the 4th dynasty, these are the Great Pyramid builders. You see that goes from 75 BCE to about 2465 BCE. Then we get a 5th dynasty. The 4th and the 5th dynasties are incredibly strong. They're incredibly strong. There's a strong central government. They have a lot of building. And in order to build things like this, you need to be able to feed people. So we know that the economy was doing well. People were fed. You had artisans that were able to, because you can tell this wasn't done by slaves. Slaves don't work like this. This was skilled artisans and sculptors and just immense African genius and a large labor force. So we know the economy is strong. We know the central government was strong to be able to get all those resources together to do that, the human resources, the material resources. So the 4th and 5th dynasties were strong. It gets a little shaky in the 6th and the 7th and the 8th dynasty. You see a lot of political turmoil, kind of like what we were talking about. You see the 7th and 8th dynasties only last 20 years. So we got 2 different families that take over within 20 years, which means there's a lot of political upheaval, a decentralization of the government, because even though it was a united kingdom, let me go back, they still kept the Sapats as the local governments. So yeah, there was a pharaoh in Memphis, but then they would appoint governors into these 42 Sapats and local government officials. So sometimes if it was a strong pharaoh, they had control over the governors. Sometimes these governors and maybe some of these generals would feel that they can overthrow the pharaoh, or there was some court intrigue, or some of these other things that lead to changes in dynasties. But when you have too much of this war, and maybe the Nile didn't flood the way it was supposed to flood that year, and you have problems, then you get the chaos of the 9th and the 10th dynasty. This is the intermediate period. This is where the central government breaks down. So you have pharaohs in name, but there's a lot more local government, a lot more turmoil in terms of economic turmoil. So trade isn't what it's supposed to be. You know, taxes aren't being collected. A whole lot of isfet, whole lot of chaos happens until it gets stabilized again with a strong dynasty, the 11th dynasty, which leads Egypt into the Middle Kingdom, out of the intermediate period into the Middle Kingdom, once a new dynasty comes in and reestablishes order from the top down. So what we'll get into next week, we'll talk about the Middle and the New Kingdoms next week. What happened, the Middle Kingdom is one that's often overlooked because it doesn't have a whole lot of grand monuments, but the literature that comes out of the Middle Kingdom is incredibly amazing. So we'll get into that. And then we'll get into the New Kingdom, which many people are familiar with, because you'll hear names like Ramses II, Seti, you'll hear names like Tutankhamun and Akhenaten, Hatshepsut. These are very, very famous pharaohs, and they all existed in the New Kingdom. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what happened that led to ancient Egypt's takeover by various foreign powers. And then in week 4, we'll get into Nubia. So we'll go further up the Nile, and we'll talk about Sudan, and we'll talk about Nubia, and so on and so forth. So we'll stop for today, and I'm going to turn off the